How's it going, Jin? How are you doing today?
I'm good, thank you. Thank you for having me, Joshua. It's good to meet you.
Oh, you too. So, do you mind introducing yourself?
Sure. Hi guys, my name is Jin, or Jin Hee. I'm a second-year PhD student at the University of Oxford. I study issues related to minority groups in northern Thailand. And if you don't mind, I'd just like to say hi in Korean just so that my friends and family could, listen.
안녕하세요. 저는 영국 옥스퍼드 대학교에서 지리학 박사과정을 하고 있는 임진희라고 합니다. 감사합니다.
Awesome, cool. And then, so you study political geography, correct?
Yep, that's true.
Yeah, so when and why did you start pursuing political geography?
Well, completely by coincidence, actually. So, I used to travel a lot, and my parents are kind of bad at reading maps. So finding the right way to go somewhere would be my responsibility, even as a child. And there would be some instances or incidents where I would realize that what I see on the maps is completely different from what I have to experience as a visitor. And for example, I'd like to talk about the issue of borders. There are a lot of borders that we cross internationally. But for some people, those borders are domestic. So even to move within the country, they have to go through certain processes that need to be undertaken. In an administrative sense, they have to ask for example, like permission. Yeah, so those discrepancies of what I see and what people actually have to go through, those are the things that interested me.
Yeah, so actually, it's funny enough you said that because I felt like crossing borders to me is actually just what motivated me to start studying mobility, or just at the end of the day, a common interest in everything,
Sure.
that I did, because it sounds very simple, but there's just so much into crossing borders, right? Just like, yeah, I think you touched on it. Like, one is just like the agency behind it. Like, are you able to, the motivation behind it? And then, so how would you say, like, I guess the bigger, or how would you describe just geography as a wider concept, or something that's commonly misunderstood about what it's really about?
Well, the common perception of geography is that we draw maps and we understand maps. Of course, that's the majority of my friends. But unfortunately, I am not necessarily knowledgeable about, the capital city of each country, or what kind of natural resources are there in specific parts of the world. But what I think of when I hear the word geography is exactly like what I've just talked about before, that there is a discrepancy of what we see or what we read or what we think we see on the map and what's actually there. And because maps are drawn by people, some aspects are deliberately or unintentionally overlooked, ignored. So I think that's the beauty of geography. So it's like a movement in between the macroscopic and microscopic view of the world towards the world. So yeah, I mean, if you're interested, I say go for it. Apply to Department of Geography.
I love the fact that you said just like, how we have our perception, and I think we all know our perception is subjective, but I think we also know that there are forces at play that determines our perception, but we also at the same time don't know what we don't know. I'll never forget, I saw this video, I think it was like of the West Wing, and they just talked about how the map, and it was like, did you know the real size of Africa, is way bigger than what it is. And, it makes just basically our maps are very Eurocentric in itself,
Exactly.
So then kind of going to your research, it looks like you're studying or working on, you had one paper, infrastructural intersection and everyday experiences of state and status in northern Thailand. So, we're here in northern Thailand in Chiang Mai right now. So do you mind, talking about that and your learnings?
Well, I'm 2 months into my fieldwork, and so far I'm looking at how people's lives, especially if they belong to the marginalized or minority groups, how their everyday lives are shaped by state-built infrastructure. And one thing that I want to clarify is that when we hear the word, or when we speak the word infrastructure, it's so easy to just think of railways or roads and highways, the built environment. But infrastructure is so big in a sense that the rules and regulations that govern the use of the roads is also infrastructure. Academically, we call that soft infrastructure. So it's not just how people access certain built environment of urban space. It's about how people feel when they look at regulations, say, for example, that, during those hours, you cannot use the road. But what would happen if, those are your working hours? How do you go about, supporting your family? So those are the questions that I'm asking in my research.
Oh, perfect. And then so the more you learn about that, you know, and that's why it's important for people listening and more people to listen to this stuff, because then I feel like that then impacts us on a policy level, right? Like I think, you know, when we think about, oh, there's going to be a new law passed about road building or what time we can use a road, I think we'd often be like, But now knowing like, how it's impacting people's everyday lives and such like that, especially the marginalized, then you're suddenly interested in more. And then you do a lot of research on ethnic minorities in Thailand. So for those that may not know, like what the ethnic minorities are, particularly in Thailand, do you mind highlighting that?
Well, highlighting can be a bit difficult because it's such a diverse and loaded question.
True.
But one group of people that I could talk about is a combination of 9 ethnic minority groups that are administratively categorized together. Now, I don't really want to use the word given to them by the authorities because, I mean, who wants to refer to 9 different groups as one category, right? It's so diverse internally. So, some of them were subject to a very particular development project back in the 1960s and 1980s. So they are partly incorporated into the state development system. And like, what about their position now? I mean, we see, for example, a lot of coffee shops that are run by ethnic minority groups. They have an ethnic representation. It depends on how you refer to ethnic representation. But for example, if you look at a logo of their cups, you see, like a very eccentric dresses or like, gowns or like headwear. So, I mean, how do people consume it? How do people come across it? And are they happy with those representations that are sometimes forced upon them? So those issues.
So 2 things. So, curious, would this be like the quote unquote hill tribes that we're referring to?
Yeah.
Or, I'm sure there might be a better name for it.
So in English, yes, it's hill tribes. But in Thai, it's an interesting, translation because it translates as Chao Khao. And Khao, as you know, in Thai means other. So the word itself refers the other. I mean, just by calling them the hill tribe or Chao Khao, we're excluding them from the national narrative of the we, as in the Thai people or Thailand, however that is conceptualized.
Yeah, that's very true. I mean, it makes me just think about, you know, I think every country has its version of it, you know, so like, for example, you know, in the States, there's perceivably like the white standard or just like, you know, like once you define one and like leave everyone else to be as other, like, you know, even it's unintentional, it does some kind of like subtle insertion of that you are another, that you're not part of the larger. And then so likewise too, I imagine that there are also minorities that are from other nationalities as well, you know, so what would you say, you know, I guess the non-Thai national minority, because I know like, would it be like the Burmese and such like that?
Yeah, there are a lot of second generation migrant groups. And what kind of position do they occupy in this country culturally, historically, especially economically? Do they face certain barriers, or do they actually make use of the fact that they are second generation migrants because they speak more than one language by birth?
Right.
So, I mean, one thing that I just regretted just now is using the word marginalized, because that's just my perspective, right? How can I call them marginalized without having lived their lives? So, I mean, there are many dimensions to their lives that we have to consider before labeling them in a certain way. Yeah,
it's like the power of the words we use, because I know I use that word a lot, and it's like, it's like the intention behind it, but then also you have to be aware of, even though this may be said with the right intention, what else are you also potentially saying, you know, when you say that, right?
Yeah.
I guess, so then now when it comes to, especially in the context of travel, right, you know, and tourism, lots of times, you know, when we have these experiences in a country, we may say, oh, wow, I want to experience this group, you know, you know, or just, I guess let's just say cultural displays by different groups within a country. So what are some things that you think we should be mindful of when doing that? Yeah, so one thing that I want to give as an example is the long neck Karen, the ethnic minority groups. So I went to this museum called the Hill Tribe Museum in Chiang Rai. Maybe there's a reason why they, you know, named the museum with the word Hill Tribe. But in one particular section, they criticized how the tourism industry has commodified the Karen ethnic group by
kind of enforcing this long neck tradition, which in fact is not indigenous to Thailand.
Oh, wow.
So I wonder, that's what the display on the museum said. I wonder, then where did it come from? And how is that photo displayed in the tourism agencies all across Chiang Mai, which supposedly takes tourists to the remote mountainous areas? Because many of the Karen people do not live in the remote mountainous areas. So is the tourist industry or, the tourists, but they don't really have the vicious intent, right? They don't really know.
Right.
So are they unintentionally or even with a good intention to give some economic benefit to the community? Are they deliberately separating them from the wider community, by enforcing some kind of image of indigeneity or tradition or culture or the exoticness? So I think those are the things that we can ask when we go somewhere or we think about going somewhere.
Yeah, that's, yeah, cause I think that too, cause so for example, been to many countries, but then for example, we in Panama specifically, we have a lot of indigenous groups. And so I think it's always an interesting subject in itself because so for example, you have the Kuna Indians and, everywhere you go, it's a proud part of our ethos is that we incorporate them in our culture very well. So you have the molas and such, which is their artwork. And then, we're told that, they have their own sovereignty in many ways. But then I guess when I do research or then maybe I talk to someone maybe a little closer to the issue, I then get a very different, look. So then it's almost wow, is there maybe for lack of a better term, a commodity version that we're kind of being presented
exactly.
and how is that different from the real day-to-day life of these people?
Yeah.
And to that point, I know that you mentioned before that there are certain parts of the culture that's celebrated as exotic, it's new, whereas other parts are of their lives are simply ignored. Do you want to elaborate on that?
Yeah. That's actually an idea that I got from a book and the title that I cannot remember anymore. But the author used the word curate. So the tourism industry or, the higher power, whatever that may be, is literally curating what to show to the international consumers or visitors. And they're just deliberately overlooking the rest, either because they think it's embarrassing or maybe they think it's bad for the unity of the country. So let me use the example of the word developing country. So that's a term that I think is used very commonly, but there are scholars who criticize that term because sometimes those countries are underdeveloped. Of course, subjective evaluation or judgment, but those countries are pushed down to either benefit the so-called developed countries. So the vocabulary that we use to a specific group of countries can also be used or applied to these ethnic groups. So are tourists or the tourism industry in general, are they deliberately keeping them in this underdeveloped position by only celebrating what they want to see? Because one of the reasons that the tourists are here in Thailand, or in fact any parts of the world, is because they want to get away from their everyday lives in their respective countries. And in many cases, that's work and dealing with family issues or relationship issues and everything. So they want to see something new. They want to see something that is very distant, which doesn't really remind them of home because they're traveling because they've had enough of home for a while, right? Yeah, that's what I meant in my bio. So what are the things that are celebrated for the outsiders? And while perhaps ignoring or not reflecting the intention of people who actually have to live those kinds of lifestyles.
Yeah, and there's no way to escape it, but at the same time, it's just something we could be mindful of too, because it's, me, myself, obviously I'm a tourist. I obviously would never go anywhere with the ill intent of keeping anyone in their position. It's almost because they're not the quote unquote mainstream or the status quo culture, that's why I want to find out about them even more. But then, to your point, I also have to be that much more selective of the vendor or the experience I may be going on, because how are they properly presenting these people? And of course, if I don't know, it's hard to determine that. But, maybe just like that extra 5 or 10 minutes of research, I think you could generally kind of get like a sense, or maybe when you're on the experience, you could get a feel of it,
Yeah,
too.
absolutely.
So, and to that point, they're controlling or like they're influencing what they want us to see. And then now like to the part of like what we actually do see, you mentioned something about the tourist gaze, which is what tourists expect when they think of like the ethnic minority. So, curious what you mean by tourist gaze.
Yeah, so the word tour, I think, means temporary visit. We literally tour across like a certain village or a certain town, and then we leave. I think that's the key point of tourism. For somebody who's in, I don't know, Chiang Mai for a week or for a month, they know they're going to go back home, and they're going to go back to a place where they feel safe and comfortable. Now, what about people who live here? People who have to kind of like showcase their lifestyle or their tradition or their culture to the people who are only here temporarily. What kind of influence do the tourists have or leave for long term? And when they see something, and seeing is itself such a political and selective process, right? It's just so easy to turn a blind eye without knowing. Or maybe they do it like with a benign intention.
Mm-hmm.
They turn a blind eye because they want to respect and this is a word that I want to be really careful, is the local people. What does that even mean, right?
Right.
So the tourist gaze, when I say that word, it means seeing something while knowing that you're here temporarily. There's a safe place that you can go back to. And because you feel that way, you can control the way you see something. And then in that case, what kind of influence would that have on the people who are living here, people who have to live here, people who cannot go back because this is their home, right?
Right. I find it interesting, having been part of several tour groups, both as a customer and maybe leading them. Sometimes it's like, I would hear things of like, oh, I didn't really like that city because it was so westernized, for example. Or it's just like, it seemed like too developed. And though I understand what it meant, and I actually think it's normally coming from a good place, right? They want something to feel real. To me, it kind of comes with this assumption that if you're in a foreign place that they're not going to be as quote unquote developed, or that, I don't know, like what if Thai people, they're just like you, they like bowling alleys, they play pool, they have, great electronics, the mall is really nice. Like, would it be, you go to Kuala Lumpur, just like fabulous malls, and and it's like, oh, that's westernized. It's like, no, that's them. Like these are the local people doing local things.
Exactly.
Like, yeah, just made me think of all that.
Yeah, so can I add a bit more to what you just said? So what you just said about, the West and the image that we have of the West is so interesting because 2 points that I want to mention. And I really don't want to come across as trashing my friend. So he's a politics major, and then he talked about the idea of, democracy. He supposedly had a seminar on democracy. And then he was talking about how the term democracy is used differently across the so-called Western countries and the rest. I have no idea what he meant by that. And then he was suddenly conscious of, because I was the only non-white person in the room. And then he was suddenly sort of conscious of my presence, and then immediately added, and when I mean West, I also include Japan and Korea. And I was like, okay, can you expand more? But in a way that actually makes more sense. So we have this ideal image of the West, or maybe it's not ideal, just an imagined community called the West. And something that is outside of it, we say, oh, it's either exotic or traditional, and we still frame it in such a nice way because we want to experience it. We want to showcase it, for example, on Instagram, that we're here to see precisely that. Right. Which brings me to the next point. You said something about like being Thai. And because my research focus is ethnic groups, are they Thai? I mean, who determines that? I think we have to ask them.
True.
If they say, well, I am ethnically, or originally, my parents, for example, can be Karen or Aka or Lisu, but they might think that I'm Thai. I speak the language. I went to a government-run school. All of my friends are Thai. For example, young people of the Lahu ethnic origin, they don't speak the Lahu language. Their parents do, but they don't understand it.
Right.
So how do we label a group as an ethnic group when they don't agree with it?
Right.
But a lot of tourists do it, and like I said before, with a benign purpose. They don't mean to be discriminating against other people. So it's just an issue of just thinking one more time. And I know it's difficult because once you start thinking about that, traveling becomes almost impossible.
Right.
And it also becomes like almost like an uncomfortable experience. But I think it's a question worth asking at least once.
I love that. And actually, like you said, it's, I feel like the purpose of these conversations isn't like to completely turn you off. It's like, you can't do this, you can't do that.
Yeah.
But it's like, it's all about mindfulness at the end of the day. We all need to practice mindfulness in our daily lives, but it's like, it's basically saying how to be a mindful traveler, right?
Yeah.
We're not saying what you can and cannot do, or you are this type of person, but if we all at least just become a little more conscious or think about these things more, then it kind of makes our conversations more sophisticated. And I feel like it actually makes your own travel experience more rewarding, right?
Exactly.
You know, because you have the knowledge and the feeling that you're engaging in it, in a better way, potentially.
Yeah.
And then, so I'm just curious what it's like being here in Thailand or just traveling in general, as a Korean, with your background.
Yeah. I mean, so it's interesting. Because I try to kind of not talk about my nationality because my research focuses on ethnic groups.
Okay.
So, but then again, Korean is only one part of like my identity, right? So it's funny because when I go to the UK, because that's where I study, the fact that I am a woman is not as important as the fact that I'm an international student. So the Korean fact suddenly becomes less important because I'm an international. I'm not the UK citizen or the domestic student. And then when I go back to Korea, because the majority of my friends and my family members are Korean, so the Korean aspect suddenly diminishes. And I'm a woman. Okay, I don't really want to reveal my age, but I'm a woman. And when I'm here, people don't perceive me as Korean because when I meet my interviewees or my research participants, I say I'm a PhD student from the University of Oxford. I can't really imagine them telling stories about their migration background or their family history to a Korean tourist walking down the street. I have this long, repeated conversation. So yes, I am Korean, but there are so many dimensions of my identity that are kind of highlighted when I meet different groups of people.
It's funny, like, I feel you 100%. Like, in America, race is such a thing, right? And so in America, I'm black all day long. I have lots of other identities, but I feel like that is my leading identity there in terms of how I navigate America. But then I go abroad, and then I remember when I was in Dubai, that was my first professional trip abroad. And that was maybe the first time where I felt more American than black or anything else, because economy's centered around expats. And so I was just seen as like this Western person. In other contexts of when I travel, kind of like how you said, it's always interesting on what stands out, to them. Yeah. In America, I also feel very Panamanian, but of course, when I'm in Panama, I embrace being American. Like, I don't relate the same.
Yeah. And if I could just add a bit more on that, I mean, I like the term inside outsider. I'm thinking about actually making that the title of my thesis.
Yeah, trademark it.
Yeah. So, I think no matter where we go, either as a tourist or a researcher or an expat or maybe, as a permanent migrant, I think we are all inside outsiders and outside insiders because the boundary of whichever community that we think we belong to is so blurry and so ambiguous that by trying to kind of like decide or determine that I am this or I am that is such a violent process for myself and to other people that I might be unaware of. So, I mean, those are the layers of ourselves that I think is really interesting. And I think that the boundary of what's inside and what's outside, it's within ourselves. And the more we explore it, I think the more interesting our life gets.
That speaks to so many things going on across whether, like I said, national identity, racial, sexual identity, so on and so forth. Mindfulness at the end of the day. Cool. So to kind of sign off, I know you said that you believe that first and foremost, the principle should be to do good when we're traveling. And that's something much more comprehensive and proactive than do no harm. So, for people to take away something amongst everything that we said, what does it mean to do good as we're traveling?
Okay, let me just phrase it in a really straightforward way. To not make people feel like crap about what they are and who they are. And when we are seeing something as an outsider, we're judging them unintentionally and, not with a vicious purpose. And people who are subjected to it, they might feel discouraged or suddenly unsure of their future. Because by nature, I think we always compare ourselves to another person. We are always in a relationship. We're not isolated islands. I think the entire point of do good is don't make other people feel like crap when you're there, like I said, temporarily. Yeah, because the feeling crap part, it can last.
Yeah. Nonetheless, so what has been the most rewarding part of your travel experiences or what you've learned abroad here?
Well, rewarding for me is learning to judge people less. I can't say that I'm not judgmental because I'm pretty sure I am. And even though I try to be as mindful as I can, some people might feel discriminated against, like, by me. So, okay, let me give you an example. So, in Korea, things are fast. When I send a text message to a person, I can expect that I will hear back from them in 1 or 2 hours. I won't have an instance where my text will remain unread for days. But here, maybe because of the nature of the groups that I'm researching, sometimes my texts are left unread for 24 hours. And in that case, if I was in Korea, I could just go crazy. Like, did I do something wrong? Did I say something offensive? And maybe I did. And maybe they don't really want to say because they're being considerate towards me. But here, because I know that the way of communicating is a bit different. When I say here, I mean the groups that I'm researching. I try to be more understanding. Is that the word? I just try to accept it. I won't say like, oh, like, why wouldn't they respond? Or why wouldn't they reply? I would say, okay, well, I'm here as a researcher. So I'm going to just absorb everything and not be judgmental because, Korea is just one country, one part of the world, right?
Right.
So, and maybe it's an exception.
Right.
So yeah, that's something I'm learning to do.
I think a good word for that is compassion.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Oh, awesome. Well, on that note, really appreciate you taking your time to come out here today. There is a lot of fascinating things just both about your personal story and your research. So I guess before we go, anything left that you may want to say or just like, a message for those listening?
I think whatever you see, there's a story to it.
Mm-hmm.
So when you're here as a tourist, you're mostly here to see. That's why we take photos, right? It's a visual experience. But I think it can be more rewarding and definitely more enjoyable if you try to hear what other people have to say. And I think it can only make you feel more excited about wherever you are. And even though when you go back to your respective homes or places that you're from, it just enriches your everyday lives even after you go back. So I think use 5 or more, even more senses that you have when you travel.
Perfect. Cool. Well, thank you very much again. Take care. Appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
Awesome.